Welcome to my presentation today about my use of audio feedback in my semester at St. Mary's as a result of what I learned at Tech Camp. I teach a writing in the discipline class in my department, and I decided to integrate audio feedback into that particular course as part of a scaffolded writing project. The reason why was because there were a few different drafts that were involved, and I figured that audio feedback in a progressive nature would be useful for this particular project. So specifically, I planned on giving audio feedback in addition to written feedback at the outline phase and the rough draft phase for the introduction of their writing in the discipline project. I'd heard from other faculty who used audio feedback that they tended to find it fairly easy to do, and that students tended to be very responsive to it, that it tended to impart tone, and that it tended to be something that they could engage with regularly, both listening to it over and over again, as well as listening to it while they were reviewing their paper. So I thought, why not give it a try? The first thing I did audio recording for was for the outline part of their progressive paper, and I basically recorded it using the microphone feature on Windows to record a .wmv or Windows media file, and then emailed them the media files. The problem was that students who used Macs had some problems playing the media files, and that was an initial hiccup. Learning from my initial mistakes with the outline phase, for the rough draft phase of the introduction, I recorded sound files using .mp3. I had a program called Audacity that could convert files into MP3 files, and students tended to be, it was a lot easier for them to interface with this particular type of file. On the whole, I found this a fairly positive process. I found it fairly easy to implement the voice grading into my process. It didn't take too much additional time, and students appeared to find the audio files to be really very useful for them. I did see a distinct improvement from the outline to the rough draft. The rough draft to the final paper wasn't quite as good, so I need to work a little bit more on that. And I also need to make sure that students know that they can come by to my office in addition to listening to the audio feedback instead of using that as a replacement. So I might encourage students, or maybe even require them, to come by my office in addition. I think on the whole this was a successful exercise, and I will definitely implement it again with a few minor changes next semester. Here are some sample audio files from the outline version and the rough draft version from the same student, so that you can see how each of those recordings might sound. Each one is about 2 to 4 minutes long, so just a heads up.
Hey Jessica, let's see if we can't work through this together. So taking a look at your outline, there are a couple of things that immediately jump out. The first thing is that you need to think about how you're organizing your presentation of data in order to support 3 different hypotheses based on your research design and the tests that we're going to be running. Your first hypothesis is based on whether people will attribute greater likability to someone who's dressed more professionally than somebody who's dressed less professionally. That's hypothesis number 1. Hypothesis number 2 is about whether men in general will perceive the female experimenter as more or less likable than women who rate the experimenter in terms of her likability. And your third hypothesis is about how men and women might differ in how they perceive the person who's dressed professionally or not, the interaction hypothesis. So your 3 paragraphs of your introduction need to be structured around those 3 different approaches. You do a very strong job making an argument for hypothesis number 3, that men will perceive the professional woman differently than women. More specifically, that men will perceive her as more likable and that women will be more threatened by her and perceive her as less likable as a result. You pepper in the evidence for that kind of throughout. So you talk about Maynard et al. In 2008, Maynard, Dewell, and Gallia in 2006, those provide some pieces of evidence that men and women respond differently to women who are considered to be physically attractive. That would relate to hypothesis number 3. You also mentioned LeMay, Clark, and Greenberg, and that also provides some support for that particular hypothesis. That needs to go toward the end of your introduction. You need to spend a little bit more time focusing on your other 2 hypotheses as well. So your first hypothesis is, so collect all that information together and put it all in one place, first of all, and then think about the order in which you put it. Your first hypothesis and the first paragraph of your paper should be focused on generally whether people are going to rate the person who's dressed more attractively as more or less likable. So for example, when you talk about LeMay, Clark, and Greenberg, that people are more likely to attribute positive characteristics to people they find attractive, there's a heightened motivation to bond, that could provide evidence that people are going to be more likely to attribute positive characteristics to somebody who's dressed more professionally. So think about how that relates to your first hypothesis and provide that in a first body paragraph that really focuses on the perceived likability of somebody who's dressed more professionally versus not. Your second body paragraph is a little trickier, and that's whether men are more or less likely to rate a woman as likable compared to a woman rating a woman. So to think generally about how there might be gender differences in terms of how men rate the likability of women and women rate the likability of women, regardless of how they're dressed. So this is focused on your second hypothesis and your second test that you're going to be running, which is generally testing the differences between males and females, your second independent variable, on perceived likability of the experimenter, your dependent variable. So you need to gather some evidence about that and talk about that a little bit more, because that was kind of missing from your paper. And of course, then your third hypothesis, you have a bunch of evidence for, but you need to gather all in one place. So that very first overview section, just to kind of look back at that very briefly, I would say you need to start with your research question, provide a definition of attractiveness, and that's it. And then your second paragraph, your dependent variable overview, you need to jump right into hypothesis number 1 and talk about the research about that, and then have a second paragraph for hypothesis number 2, and then a third paragraph for hypothesis number 3. Let me know if you have questions about the general organization of this and what your hypotheses are, so that we can talk about it a little bit more. I think you have some information there already that applies to hypothesis number 1 and hypothesis number 3, but it was missing any information that you could use for hypothesis number 2. So let me know if that's clear or not, and we can talk about it further later.
Okay, Jessica, let's go ahead and work through this second draft together. So first of all, I thought you had a really strong opening paragraph. I really liked your opening example and quote. I thought it was a really strong start. I think make sure that you are adding in gender when you talk about the purpose of your study, that it's not just to determine whether a person is more professional, is more likable, but also how men and women perceive professional women. That's kind of what you're looking at a little bit more specifically. Keep in mind that your paragraph should start broad and end up narrow, that it should start focusing on other research and end up focusing on yours. So I think you want to kind of refocus a little bit so that you spend much more time talking about other people's research to begin with, and then end up talking about your own research toward the end of the paper. So for example, I would argue that your introduction actually starts in earnest down all the way on page 3 after that opening paragraph. So you have your opening paragraph and then dive straight into that part about Chatelain in 2015, where you start talking about what previous research has shown in terms of how people within positions of authority will be seen as more approachable and likable if they're dressed professionally than casually. That's a really great start to talking about what other research has shown in terms of how people perceive those who are professionally dressed. So I would say that's where your paper actually starts, in that second paragraph. That should be your second paragraph of your paper. Let's see. And once again, you're going to be talking mostly about what other research has shown, and then save the methodology of your own study and your hypotheses that you have that are specific to your study to the very end of the paper. So you need to do a little bit of rearranging and refocusing of some of your paragraphs. I think you have the content there. It's just a matter of rearranging it a little bit further. So you have great sources, the Elsinore and Lever study about how women in positions of leadership are considered to be less likable and approachable than their male counterparts. Really lends itself to your logic and your argumentation. I thought that was a really great source. You want to go ahead and toward the end of your paper have a separate paragraph that talks about how men might perceive professional women differently than women, and then dive into your study's methodology and hypotheses. So that needs just a little bit more clarity in terms of separation. That needs to be a separate paragraph, and then it would follow with your method and hypotheses. So let me know if you have questions about how you're going to go about doing that. I think, once again, all the research is there, but most of your paper tends to have a slightly different focus on it toward the beginning. It's more about your research. It should be more about other people's research. Keep in mind just general tone as well, that whereas it's not forbidden to use I, that it should be sparing, and that it should probably refer to what you think is going to happen in terms of your study's hypotheses, rather than having it be such a central part of your overall paper. So just something to kind of keep in mind there. And just work on formalizing it up a little bit in terms of the general tone. I thought on the whole the content was there. It just needs a little bit of rearranging and a little bit more polish. So let me know if you have any questions.